Anyway, welcome to everybody who is here. Today I'm going to take a look at some of the questions you have asked about modern politics. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I am a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. It's white. And so let's get down to it today with the question that is at the top of everybody's list, that at least that I could tell from your questions, and that is, let's talk about guns, and let's talk about gun control, and let's talk about the history of guns. So there were a ton of questions that covered a lot of different aspects of gun control, and one of them is, has gun violence always been part of American culture? Will we ever have gun reform? How did we get such a strong connection between the National Rifle Association and the Republicans, and so on? That's actually what I plan to write about tonight. So I will walk you through some of what I plan to talk about today. So I want to start with the history of the NRA. And I find this really interesting because I started studying the NRA in 2017 after the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. And I literally, of course, we were still on campus then, I literally went to the library to read the book on the history of the NRA. Man, there is nothing out there. So I ended up spending many hours myself that night, actually, that day and night, actually researching the history of the NRA, which is remarkably interesting, than more than you would expect. And I will start by saying that I actually have a long history of the NRA because I grew up in a rural community where people hunted. My parents ran a hunting and fishing magazine. I was very accustomed to having guns around, and the NRA used to come into our schools and give us lessons on gun safety. So, when I was a kid, the NRA was just, I don't know, they just were around, and they weren't what they are now. And people drove around in the pickup trucks, and you'd have guns across the back in the racks, and people would have them at school. Not the guns in the school building, but certainly the guys' trucks would have the guns in the back. So, I never had that horror of the NRA, and like you people, a lot of you, I suspect, I didn't quite see how we got from literally taking gun safety classes. And yes, I've shot guns. I don't hunt. I'm not. I many of my friends hunt. My parents ran this hunting and fishing magazine, but I don't really have the patience for it, and it's just not my thing. If I'm going to be out in the woods, I'm just going to be walking. But there's a longer conversation to be had about the relationship between hunting and preservation of the wilderness. And as my dad always said, the best conservationists in the world were the hunters, because they were actually out in the woods and taking care of it. In any case, I don't hunt, but I'm certainly familiar with guns. I've shot guns, including muskets, which are beautiful. But so anyway, this whole transformation into, the people carrying the AR-15s at the grocery store is just absolutely bizarre. So I started looking into this. And what I learned, first of all, was that the NRA actually began in 1871, which is my sweet spot, right? It was in the period after the Civil War, and it begins in New York. And it begins in part for really three reasons. And the first is because during the Civil War, which had ended less than a decade before, had begun about a decade before, a lot of the people who had been marksmen during the war and were quite proud of their marksmanship were starting to lose their skills. And remember, it's really with the Civil War that America starts to get rifles. And the difference between a musket and a rifle is important. It's important for the war, but it's also important for the profession and the sport of shooting, because the difference is sort of the difference between a knuckleball and a fastball. So a musket has just a tube. And what happens when you put force behind a ball, and musket balls are round, I actually have some here, and I'm not going to dig them out for you, but a musket ball is round, and so when there's a push behind it, it spins wildly. I mean, you can't really predict how it's going to spin, so it's very hard to be terribly accurate with a musket. Although the very good musket shooters you learn to know your weapons, so you end up shooting fairly accurately. There can be quite good musket shooters, but there's still a number of people who shoot the old traditional muskets, and there are some people who still make the old traditional muskets. And weirdly enough, I had this conversation yesterday with somebody. if you are ever at someplace like LL Bean in Freeport, Maine, or the Kittery Trading Post in Kittery, Maine, they actually have some old handmade muskets for sale. They're $1 gazillion, but they're cool to look at. Anyway, I'll shut up on the history of gun making. But although I'd love to tell you more about that, because the indigenous people also adopted new forms of gun making. But I'll stop, because that's not what you asked about. But so what happens is, during the Civil War, America starts to get used to imports, and then starts to produce rifles. And the difference between a musket and a rifle, there's a number of them, but one of them is that the tube through which the gun barrel through which the projectile is going to go has actually a little spiral in it, a little bead in it. And the bullets that you are now accustomed to when you think of a bullet is shaped kind of like the tip of a pen. So what happens is and there's a little indent in the bottom of it in the early ones, and the pressure from the gunpowder expands the back of the end of the bullet, and it spins in the barrel of the bullet, so it goes much farther and much faster. And once that happens, people who handle the rifles can be what are called sharpshooters. So it becomes, during the Civil War, first of all, deadly, but it also becomes a bit of a sport, because you can set up a can on a stump somewhere and have the men all trying to shoot that can. Whereas with a musket, there's really no point, because, I don't know, it'd be like trying to get me to hit something with a baseball. It ain't going to happen. So during the war, they get the development of this idea of marksmanship. Now, so in 1971, people who had been doing this during the Civil War want to bring it back. They don't want to lose those skills. And they also kind of miss hanging out with a bunch of guys and shooting things, which, remember, a lot of the war was just sitting around doing stuff like that. And so they're eager to bring back that comradeship. But then they are also interested in the fact that Britain has always had, I'm sorry, I don't know British history, so I shouldn't say always. Britain had, at that point, had for a long time a history of sport shooting, of elite shooting amongst British sportsmen, and it was a thing in Britain. So right at that period in America, in the 1870s, as we are starting to get an industrialized society and the rise of white collar workers, the people who are pushing the paper for the Union Pacific Railroad, for example, they start to have leisure time, and they start to have money, and they start to import sports to America. So we get, for example, in the 1880s, we get tennis comes to America, lawn tennis as they know it then. Skiing comes from Scandinavia. They get these idea that you actually could spend time in an afternoon just playing a hobby, playing around, playing a sport. And into this period drops the idea of shooting and the National Rifle Association, right? Okay, that's 71. And rifle clubs spring up across the country in the 1870s and the 1880s, until by the 1920s, rifle shooting was a really popular sport. And it was a popular sport to the point that there are groups called riflemen, and the riflemen compete in the Olympics. Most people don't pay attention to the fact that America still fields a very active shooting team in the Olympics, and we tend to do very, very well in that. Doesn't usually get a lot of TV press, but they're very skilled marksmen in that sport. There are also college rifle teams and local rifle teams. There's state tournaments, there's national tournaments. The NRA organizes tournaments, and people are really proud of their ability to be a good shot. And so if when I was doing this research into it, if you looked at people's obituaries, for example, it would say things like he was a great rifleman, or a great marksman, or he was a member of the NRA. In the same sort of way, it would say he's a great golfer. It was a sport. It was considered a sport. So what happens is that there is a period, and the NRA is really adamant in this period here from the, let's say, 1880 to the 1920s, that it is not going to be ruined by big business the way so many things have been. So in 1925, a new secretary of the NRA goes ahead and actually takes money, or appears to take money from the manufacturers of both ammunition and guns. And when that happens, the NRA board throws him out of the organization and sues him They don't want any association with big business in that period in which, first of all, big business is considered negative, but also after World War I, there is the sense that munitions makers had been responsible for World War I and had made money on the guns. They were called the merchants of death, and they don't want to be associated with that. So what happens then is that, of course, in the 1920s, during Prohibition, when alcohol becomes illegal, we get the rise of gangs and bootlegger gangs. And I'm going to put in a plug here for a fabulous museum in Las Vegas called the Mob Museum, which now is online because of COVID. You can actually see their films and stuff online. But if you're ever in Las Vegas, go to the Mob Museum. It's totally cool. Totally cool. And it talks about how the mob actually rises because of Prohibition. It's actually in a former courthouse where there had been mob trials. Anyway, so you get the rise of bootlegging and the bootlegging gangs. And with that, you get tremendous fears of the kinds of violence that those gangs are inflicting on society. So, for example, you get the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is the assassination of, I think it's 6 members of one gang by another's. And that's considered crazy to have the idea that one gang could gun down 6 members of somebody else. So the NRA actually backs, and I'm saying this slowly so you hear it, actually backs federal legislation to limit concealed weapons, to prevent the ownership of guns by criminals, by the mentally ill, and by children. It requires all dealers to be licensed, and it requires background checks before the delivery of weapons. Again, that's the NRA who's behind all those limits to gun ownership. It continues to insist that ordinary citizens have the right to own rifles and to own handguns, but it distinguishes very clearly, on the one hand, between law-abiding citizens who should have access to guns for hunting. And remember, many people are still going to be hunting. It's only in about 1920 that more people live in urban areas than live in rural areas. So for hunting, for target shooting, and for protection, but on the other hand, criminals and mentally ill people, and they do not want those people to have guns. So in the 20s and 30s, that's the stand that the NRA takes. And in fact, in 1934, the NRA backs the National Firearms Act. And as late as 1968, it's going to be backing gun control. It's going to be backing, in 68, it's going to back parts of the National Gun Control Act that was designed to stop the spread of guns in the 1960s. All right, so what happens then? What happens is really interesting. And again, I'm sort of untangling this for tonight. But what happens is that in the middle of the 1970s, there's the NRA splits. There's a factional fight in the NRA, and it splits. And the faction that gains control begins to take a stand against what it calls, quote, gun control. And in 1975, it forms a political action committee, a PAC. And 2 years later, in 77, it elects a new president of the NRA who abandons the idea of sporting culture and goes all in on the idea of gun rights. And I'm going to explore more about that in just a second, but I will point out that this is exactly the period, this is precisely the period when in the 1970s, when I was in the schools and getting lessons about gun safety. That's when it still was. By 77, it's going to change. And I mean, I'm still in the schools in 77, but they weren't giving us, this was, our lessons were in middle school. So I was out of middle school by then. So I'm sort of one of the last people who got the here's how you handle a firearm thing, or safely thing. And that you got to keep them locked up. You got to have gun lockers, you know. We learned all that stuff, just like, I don't know, what else did you learn? We had home ec classes and shop classes too. So the NRA was part of that. They were in the schools trying to teach safety. But what's interesting is that when the NRA went into politics, which it did with this political action committee, it went into politics in a way that looked very much like the other major industries in the 1970s and the 1980s. And they suddenly begin to oppose all limits on gun ownership, even though Basic safety measures for guns have always been popular, even among the NRA's membership. And right now, 90% of Americans want background checks. 90%. Which is, crazy numbers, crazy high numbers. But the NRA went in the other way, saying, no, we have this absolute right to bear arms. And they begin to work with politicians, those movement conservatives I've talked so much about, to work within the Republican Party. They go in through with the idea, the movement conservatives have this idea that you can't have any kind of they don't want any kind of regulation on American society. And now these new NRA people are working on their side as well. And as I say, they begin to call themselves conservatives, but they are very radical in the sense that they're taking this organization in a direction it has never been. That's not what the NRA stood for. So they insist that any kind of attempt to infringe on somebody's right to bear arms is a form of communism or socialism, and are increasingly call for their supporters, for political supporters at this point, to arm themselves. And now one of the pieces here that's really important to remember, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the political implications of this, is that guns and ammunition are expensive. So the more you can convince people to be frightened and buy guns and ammunition, especially ammunition is quite expensive, that's big business. The actual numbers of ammunition sales, there's serious money to be made in ammunition. Guns as well, but in ammunition, which one has to do, obviously has to get more and more of, especially if you're target shooting, for example. But so finally in 1980, the NRA went ahead and it endorsed a presidential candidate for the first time in its history. Remember, before they threw out their secretary and sued him when he tried to get politically active. By 1980, they have endorsed Ronald Reagan. And with the endorsement of Ronald Reagan and his ascension to the presidency, of course, big business, including the NRA, is going to get more and more power. And they're not there just because of the big business angle of it, but also because they do represent, I think, this movement conservative, individualistic image of the cowboy with his gun. And you see this in language like that from the late Rush Limbaugh, who, when he his talk show host, talk radio show takes off after 1988, he talks a lot about cowboys and carrying their guns, and there's this image of the cowboy with everything that it stands for. The idea he wants nothing from government, which, as you know, is a myth. He does. He dominates the people around him that he considers savages. He has a woman that he could make a home with, and the sex workers. Women are either wives and mothers or sex workers. There's everything that goes with that. That gun comes to symbolize that, I think. But what happens then is that as the NRA becomes a political player, it now begins to be able to raise money through its political PACs, especially from gun and ammunition makers. So by the year 2000, the National Rifle Association was one of the 3 most powerful lobbies in Washington. And it spent more than $40 million in the 2008 election. And then when, of course, President Barack Obama is elected to the White House, gun and ammunition sales take off during the Obama administration as people insist that Obama is going to take all their guns. And then we're going to get the Trump slump that I'll tell you about in just a second. But what's interesting about the fact they're pouring the kind of money into politics that they are in 2008 is this. This always freaking shocks me. And that is that, do you know what year the Supreme Court went ahead and ruled that the Second Amendment guaranteed the right of an individual to own a gun? That actually was 2008. Until then, jurisprudence had argued that the Second Amendment did not automatically give people the unregulated right to have a gun. That is how new that legislation is. And that was District of Columbia versus Heller. And it was about the fact that the District of Columbia had a law that effectively banned handguns in the home, essentially. And it changes that year. And what's really interesting about the Columbia versus Heller decision is that it's really the one around which Justice Antonin Scalia goes ahead and begins to articulate a principle of one of the principles of originalism. And it's interesting for somebody who is interested in the development of that concept of originalism, because initially the people who talked about originalism tried to find the actual original debates, and by the time they get to Heller, they recognize that they just don't have any evidence at all for what they're talking about. So they essentially invent it. They say that this is the spirit of what it was, and that's absolutely true in the Heller decision, when there's all kinds of stuff taken out of context and everything else. So, for example, you might see sometimes references to Patrick Henry talking about the grand object is for every man to have a gun, completely taken out of context, but that shows up in the Heller decision. Anyway, so what happens is that after 2008, we start to get the Supreme Court making inroads into this idea that nothing matters more than an individual's right to own this gun. And that becomes, as I say, enormously powerful, not least because the more you ramp up the idea that somebody is coming for your guns, the more you're going to sell. And second of all, because the gun becomes this symbol, I think, of this individualistic theory that the movement conservatives embrace. So it has become this, I'm sorry, but it is completely bizarre that we have, aside from the massacres under which we are suffering, which I actually said to my students the other day, this is not normal. This is not normal. This is not okay. Again, I grew up in a town, in a society where we had guns. My family, well, whatever. There were plenty of guns. But we didn't have mass shootings because the whole meaning of a gun was entirely different than what it is now. And the fact that we have people saying they have a right to open carry and, what are essentially assault weapons is bizarre. I mean, it's just crazy. So we're not in a normal moment. And it's really important to remember that even though the people who are insisting that they are defending a right from the Constitution, in fact, what they are talking about is something that really the rules became laid down for in 2008. I mean, this is not a long-standing thing. 2008. So, that right there is the history of the NRA, and it's also, I'm sorry, the other piece that I didn't talk about here, is that one of the things that happens after Citizens United is the ability for people to pour money into American political campaigns through dark money. And the numbers, and I will write about this tonight, I didn't call them up for this talk, the numbers of how much money the NRA poured into the political system in 2016 are shocking. They are shocking. And of course, now there's quite a bit of curiosity about where all that money came from. And of course, that now the NRA is in bankruptcy. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens from there. But the NRA, when it's tweeting now, is not tweeting from a position of strength by any stretch of the imagination. You might remember they brought Oliver North on board briefly, and he started whistleblowing and saying this place is falling apart, it's all corrupt, and then there was a fight over control of the organization. You may not remember, it doesn't matter, but they're in bankruptcy right now. All right, so the question was, how can we outlaw the NRA? Well, first of all, it's in bankruptcy. But second of all, one of the things that I would like to come back to repeatedly, especially today, is when people write to me to ask questions, and I know I probably phrase that badly, there is always this sense of what is going to be done to us. It is high time for Americans to take back, this is our government. It should do what we want. And if 90% of us want background checks, we should demand them. And so are people, well, I don't know, if you've got 9 out of 10 people want something, why are we letting that one person determine what we do? So can we get reasonable gun control in this country? Yeah, sure. We just have to fight for it. And I don't mean literally fight at all. Just the opposite. Anytime anybody does anything violent in America, it weakens their cause. It doesn't strengthen it. We need to argue for it and make that the case. And like I say, I'm not against hunting guns, and I'm not against hunting. I know that always infuriates people when they hear that, but that's not what this is about. This is about power and what that gun symbolizes to people about who they think should be in charge. And it is no accident that our mass shootings are almost always white men. That's just, it's got to be on the table. There's no question about. We simply can't look the other way about that. And there's a political meaning behind that. All right, so I hope that's enough on gun control, except let me add, as I said twice now, this is not okay. It's just not okay. And people have asked, was America always this violent? No. I mean, America's always been violent. There's a long history behind that. But no, we didn't have mass massacres like this. Not within our normal everyday lives. We certainly have had massacres of indigenous populations and sometimes immigrant populations. But as a matter of your normal life, no. And I will point out that one of the things that I wasn't thinking about talking about, but I try and bring this up every time I think about it, a mass shooting is defined by 4 people being killed. And more than half of those, last time I checked the statistics, and it's been a couple of years, more than half of our mass shootings in America are associated with domestic violence. And that's the other piece that we really need to have on the table here, that we tend to look at these quite visible, horrific events, but the rate of domestic violence in this country is also simply appalling. And people say to me, are things going to get bad in America? And I'm like, as a historian, my comparison is the fact that when we look at the 1880s, we talk about just how bad the strikes were, how many thousands of strikes there were in the 1880s, and often they're just strikes of a very few people. In 100 years, people will look at this period and they will look at the extraordinary numbers of dead we have because of handguns, and they will say that we were living in a war zone, and they will not understand why we put up with it. And I have enormous sympathy for that. I don't think I know anybody who hasn't been touched by gun violence. I really don't. Anyway, all right, I'll stop preaching. A couple more questions here. You people want to know more about the issue on the southern border, and I'm certainly happy to talk about that because I think there's a ton of confusion around it. So I'm going to move this over here so I can see your questions again. Maybe. Here we go. All right. You're back here. I had a bunch of statistics up in front of me before. Yes, somebody just said something about other countries being afraid of America because of our guns. Absolutely. I lived in London for a year, and I was once in a cab with a London driver, and he said, and it wasn't one of the black ones. It was, I forget what they're called now, but just the regular guys, and he said something mildly critical about America. I don't remember. Something totally mild. And then all of a sudden he's like, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. I love America. I said, what you said was fine. He's like, don't shoot me. And I'm like, I'm not going to shoot you. I mean, the thought was that if I was an American, I must somehow have a concealed weapon around me. And it was like, we don't really all do that. All right. So now what's happening on the border? All right. So let me see if I can untangle this a little bit, because you have a lot of questions. Somebody said, isn't it time for Biden to stop taking in migrant children? The GOP is talking about open borders. What can we do about the borders? What about the problems we need to fix, et cetera, et cetera? So let's start with where we are. So when Biden and Harris came into office on January 20th, which is, 70 days ago now? About? 70 days, that's a little over 2 months. And I'm going to try and put this into some kind of perspective here. What they discovered, first of all, they didn't get much transition time because remember, Trump wouldn't turn over anything to them. So, and then there's the insurrection, and anyway. So what they discovered when they came in is that, and should not be a surprise to anybody, is that the Trump administration had gutted the services and the people who handle our border issues. So they didn't have facilities to put people in. They didn't have people, they didn't have staff. Plus they got the pandemic, and there was no plan to vaccinate the staff. And of course you can't put people into the facilities because of the pandemic. And at the same time, what they discovered is that there had been a mechanism under the Obama administration, if you were in those triangle countries that were so dangerous, El Salvador and Guatemala and, I'm sorry, I'm so tired. Guatemala, El Salvador, and I'm so sorry. What am I forgetting? The other one. I'm so sorry. Somebody put in, I'm sorry, but the triangle countries, Nicaragua. There we go, Nicaragua. If you're in those, that you could actually apply for asylum from within them. So you could send in your paperwork without having to walk to the border. But the Trump administration shut that down. They also, the other thing that Obama had done is he had put a lot of money into those countries just to try and stabilize them, into the police facilities, but also into trying to stabilize them, not least because a lot of their troubles have come from America because of some of our policies down there over the years and different ones in each one. And I am not historians of those countries, and I'm not going to talk about it because I'll put my foot in my mouth. But they didn't spontaneously decide to become unstable countries. I promise you, we had a lot to do to help that along. So Obama had tried to stabilize the countries, and he had put in place a system whereby if you were trying to get out of there to get asylum because of the danger for you and your family, you could do it by paperwork rather than walking to the border. And what happened was when Biden comes in, he discovers Trump has gotten rid of all that. He cut all the money to the countries, and he got rid of the system by which you could apply for asylum from the border. Because once again, I always say this. It is legal to apply for asylum. It is legal. It is legal to apply for asylum. That is entirely different. That is entirely different. Different people, different everything from trying to cross the border to get work. It's an entirely different kettle of fish. The only thing that's the same is the border. And that's really important. And it's also important to remember that people who come to America without papers or come with papers and then overstay those papers don't just come across the border. We have these things now called airplanes. And we don't tend to focus on that at all. And yet that's actually, I believe, how most undocumented immigrants come into this country. And they're not, people have images of undocumented people as, being Mexicans crossing the border. There's all kinds of people who come in through the airports or whatever. All right, so that's a different thing I'm probably not going to talk about at all now. But at the border, so we've got that going on. We also have, and this is the piece that I have written about a lot and should write about again because I care about this deeply. Our Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, is not part of the military. It is part of the executive branch, and it was developed and put together under the Department of Homeland Security, which came after 9/11. The whole Department of Homeland Security, the whole creation of that, by the way, was really sudden, did not have congressional input. It was really a big issue. But the people who are in charge of ICE are not responsible to the military chain of command. They are responsible to the executive branch. And and this is me editorializing, by the way, I have a huge issue with that because our military branches have a long history. And there is a great deal of pride amongst those military branches and the people who serve in them. And of course, everybody everywhere, there's going to be bad apples. But the military has its own rules and regulations to which people take seriously. The ICE people don't have that. They're responsible to the president. And so it's kind of like, they're the fish rots from the head, as people say, that whoever the president is going to have a lot to say with who belongs to ICE. So we have that going on as well, the people that during the Trump administration. Okay, but now you're asking about the Biden administration. So Biden comes in and Harris comes in, and they find that they got this huge crisis because what the Trump administration had tried to do was simply close the border and to say, you can't come across. Now, again, you can't do that. It's legal to apply for asylum. So what they had done is they had very briefly separated children and their parents for about a 3-month period in 2018, I think, off the top of my head. They did everything they could to dissuade people from crossing that border. They did things like they made it, the places where you were supposed to come across to apply for asylum, they closed those. They did all kinds of stuff to make people not come. So what happened was people continued to come, but they stayed in camps outside in Mexico, outside across the border. So now the Biden comes in, he's got all those people to deal with, because those camps are dangerous and there's people trying to apply for asylum, which is legal. All right, so that's happening. But then here's what the real problem is right now. I mean, there's many problems, but the thing that is being identified as the biggest problem right now is that the administration right off the bat is saying this border is closed because of COVID. So this has nothing to do with Trump policies or Biden policies or George Washington's policies. The CDC has said you cannot come across this border because of the pandemic. And this is true on the Canadian border too, by the way. I don't know what our position is on that, but the Canadian border also has some sort of a filter over it right now because of COVID. And I am not speaking about that definitively as to who's got it or all that, but it is my understanding that that's also a border that's a problem right now too because of COVID. So now we got this other layer on top of it. So they're saying, don't even think about it. You can't come over here because you can't cross the border because we're in a pandemic. All right. But now here's the issue. So single men, they're not a freaking chance. And families can nonetheless say, hey, wait a minute, you have to let us in because if you don't, we're under this enormous problem. We have some special circumstance. So some families have made it in. Again, that doesn't mean they go into the streets. That means they are allowed to come in and start the process of being processed, which involves paperwork and it involves a later court date. And there's an argument about how many people show up for their later court dates. At the lowest number I have seen, it's 92%, but I've seen numbers as high as 99%. So people show up for their court dates. It's not whatever Trump derogatorily called catch and release. So some families are coming in. That's not really the problem yet. Here's the problem. The problem is that unaccompanied children are trying to come in. And lots of them. And they had been. By the way, this didn't start with Biden. This had, the numbers of people crossing over had started going way up in 2019. And this happens. There's always surges at the border. So it started happening when Trump was still here. This is nothing dramatically new. What is dramatically new is that the administration is trying to handle it legally and humanely. So here's the problem with those children coming in. First of all, they're children. Second of all, there are a lot of them. But third of all, what are you going to do with them? Like, the Trump administration threw them out. Well, are you really going to throw a 12-year-old, an unaccompanied 12-year-old, into another country, into a refugee camp? The children are getting trafficked, they're getting killed, they're getting recruited for gangs. It's that, to me, that's not an option. Similarly, are you just going to let them across the border and turn them loose here? Well, that's not really an option either. So currently what happens is the Border Patrol, the Border Police take them in and process them, and they're supposed to do it within 72 hours, and they're not making them. It's been more like 75 hours, and that's really not okay. They say they're overwhelmed, and that Biden has rushed people to help process these kids. And then they go to Health and Human Services. And Health and Human Services, again, has had the problem of the fact that all of its facilities were closed. So now they're trying to bring the facilities up quickly, and they're bringing in tents, and they're bringing in other things for those kids to be in. And once they're into Health and Human Services, then the government finds a family member with luck to take them, and they find I think it's about 90% of the time they find a family member, and 50% of those are one parent or another, although that's off the top of my head, so I could be wrong about that. but they find somebody to take the kids in, and then they get out of those camps and they start the process of whether or not they can stay in the country permanently or not. But so, when people talk about closing the border altogether and saying no, it is my guess that what they're hearing is, I don't want a 24-year-old man to come over here and take my job. And it's a different thing when you're saying these are unaccompanied minors. And I look at this and I'm like, what is the government supposed to do? I mean, if you can think of a better system, what the Republicans are saying right now is, we don't want any of them. Turn them all back to where they came from. I think we have done things like that in our past. We certainly did that with ships of Jewish children who came to America before the Holocaust. We turned them away, and I don't think that's a moment in which people about which people feel very proud. Or the times that we have turned. There's another time we turned a boat full of South Asian Indians, Sikhs, I think they were, that were coming to the American Pacific coast. They got turned away, and they too went home to a bad situation. That was, I think, in the early 20th century. So I don't, I don't see personally turning loose children as an option myself. So I think that's where we are right now. So the idea is, so people have asked about transparency. So what's going on? I think people worry, and certainly there's some complaints that nothing has changed since the Trump administration, and that's just wrong, because people ask me all the time about what was happening during the Trump administration, and I scoured news sites to find photographs or interviews with children inside the camps during the Trump administration, and they were not there. They were not there. If anybody found them, it was not me, and I'm not bad at this. What's happening with the Biden administration, as you have seen, is that there have been tours of those camps, the current camps, with members of both parties, lawmakers of both parties, and with members of the Department of Homeland Security, which is Mayorkas, and and journalists have been allowed in too. Now, when you listen to journalists, remember it is their job to be in people's faces. That's their job. I know they can be really annoying, but that's what they're supposed to do, is to ask the hard questions and to be jerks if you feel that they are being that way. But it's also their job to get access, always. But that doesn't mean they should get it always. And there's always a gray area there, because one of the things that the administration has said is that, and it's interesting, so we were just talking about this in my history class about indigenous photos from the 1890s, is the kids are terrified. I mean, they're absolutely traumatized. Do you want cameras, big professional cameras in there with the children? No, that's really not okay. Both because they're traumatized and because they should have the right to have control over their own images and things like that. So there is a need to protect the children. At the same time, there is a need for us to know what's there. And it is probable that there's going to be errors on both sides, where the cameras will go too far, or the country will push back too much. But it's not the fact that you are not seeing the children themselves inside is not necessarily, it might be, but it's not necessarily an attempt to hide something. It might legitimately be an attempt to protect the children. And the way to tell the difference between that is watch and see what you think. The fact that I couldn't find anything on during the Trump administration just floored me. I think I probably wrote about that at some point. All right, so my bottom line on what's happening for right now on the border is I am very happy that the administration seems overwhelmingly to be embracing policies that are humane, and I don't just mean on the border, I mean elsewhere, and that they care deeply about democracy and about human rights. I mean, the other thing that jumps out again and again and again and again when you deal with anything having to do with the Biden administration and another country is they care about human rights. And that's really quite new. That's really quite new in American policy anyway. They're not talking about capitalism. They're not talking about communism. They're not talking about anything except human rights. And that makes me have a lot more faith in this administration than I did in the last one, which always talked about, we're going to do what's best for us. And, Trump saying, well, we're no angels when it comes to foreign policy and, that sort of thing. I would much prefer to be on this, personally, I would prefer to be on the side of human rights. All right, so a quick question here. Alfred Lund asked, and then we'll maybe take some longer ones again. Alfred Lund asked, what's the strongest argument against statehood for Washington, D.C.? And I love questions like this, which are the other side of the question. And I wanted to take that one because a year ago, a newspaper asked me to write an article about why D.C. should get statehood. And I said, well, this is a little awkward. I can't because I don't think D.C. should be a state. And they were like, whoa, that is awkward. And so I'm a good person to ask this question because I changed my mind 100%. And that's sort of the point of getting older and smarter, I think. The argument for DC being a state, the reason that Washington, DC is not a state, and the reason that it's the District of Columbia is because during the during the Continental, maybe it's the Articles of Confederation. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which. One of the early Congresses before, either under the Second Continental Congress or the Articles of Confederation, and I'm sorry I don't remember which, was meeting in Philadelphia, in the hall in Philadelphia, and they had army soldiers coming trying to get their pay that they were owed. And they were literally banging on the doors of Congress, and Congress is like, oh crap, we're in trouble here. And they tried to get the Philadelphia militia to come get the guys away from the doors, and the Philadelphia militia was kind of like, no, we're good, this works for us. And so Congress decided that when it was going to make it, try this new constitution, it was going to make sure that it had control over the space around it, so that it wasn't going to get stuck with a state being able to do this. And also it wanted to make sure that people all felt like this was their government. And that was my objection to it back a year ago when I was young and naive, that we should have this place that belongs to all of us. But I have come around in many ways. So the argument there is that this is a public space and you don't want any state to have control over it. But the obvious answer to that is we now have what we did not have in the constitutional, in the framers era, and that's the whole concept of state and national parks. You simply take the Capitol building and the mall and all the places that are sort of that we all share and make those our shared space and actually give representation to the people who live in Washington. And I have come 100% around to that because of the fact, for example, that there are many more people who live in Washington, D.C. than who live in Wyoming, for example. And it's not okay that they don't have representation. I had no idea how many people lived in Washington, D.C., by the way, when I said I didn't believe it should be a state. So the best argument is that we should have a shared space and that Congress should have control over the police around that. But I think we have discovered that the police argument is now out the freaking window after January 6th, and that there's plenty of ways for us to have public spaces without having the entire district be part of a state. But I love these backward arguments. All right. So what else did I want to go to? Do I think the filibuster will be changed and how? Somebody said, and somebody added to that, is there any possibility that the Republicans won't simply blow up the filibuster themselves the next time it will serve them? Two separate questions around the same thing. Do I think the filibuster is going to be changed? Yes, I do. And I do because of H.R. 1/Senate 1, and that is the voting rights bill that is coming up in front of the Senate any time now. And the reason for the thing that's funny about H.R. 1 and Senate 1, they're the same bill. But what they do is they protect voting. They make voting easier by having mail-in voting, for example. But they also cut big money in politics, and they end gerrymandering, political gerrymandering. And Americans, including a majority of Republicans, like both of those things. And here's the kicker with this particular bill. Americans also, as I say, like common sense gun control. So after Sandy Hook, for example, 55 members of the Senate actually wanted to pass some common sense gun restrictions, 55 members, and it was filibustered to death. Well, in this case, when you're talking about these kind of numbers that like something like with the American Rescue Plan, which was 77% of Americans, this is not low-hanging. I mean, this is not difficult. This is really low-hanging fruit. But the trick to this particular very popular piece of legislation is that really the future of our democracy hangs on it. Because without the passage of H.R. 1/Senate 1, it's the same bill, it just depends which house, which bill, where it originates. I'm not going to tell you about how these different bills work their way through. Take my word for it on that. I didn't tell you quite the truth, but it's pretty close to how it works. The trick to it is that if this doesn't pass, we have more than 250, it's about 253 today, laws in 43 state legislatures to suppress the vote primarily of Democrats. Now that's exactly what happened in, say, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Ohio. And in those states, it doesn't matter how many votes a Democrat gets. A Democrat can't win because the way the gerrymandering has been set up, and that it doesn't matter how popular they are because the way it's been set up, Republicans are always going to have a big majority. And so what we are saying is if we don't pass H.R. 1 or Senate 1, we're basically turning the entire country into the Jim Crow South, which was, certainly there were elections in the South from 1878 through to 1964, but the Democrats always won them because they had arranged things in such a way that it didn't matter how many people didn't like whoever was in power. There was no way they could win. And both sides are very aware of that. Now, here's the piece for the Republicans, though, especially for the older Republicans. Many Republicans think that's fine. They'd be perfectly happy to run things the same way the Democrats ran the South for 3 generations. But here's the problem with that. When you have no competition, you because the other people can't possibly win, first of all, you invite some kind of rebellion. But second of all, you stop bringing your A game, and you get, you really disintegrate. You end up not having ideas. You end up simply being essentially an oligarchy. And that's obviously the direction that we will go if we turn this entire country over to the next generation of Republicans who are, there are some that seem very good. I might not necessarily like Adam Kinzinger's politics, but he seems like a perfectly intelligent, principled person. But there's a big difference between a Republican like Kinzinger from Illinois and Lauren Boebert or Madison Cawthorn. And do you really want to turn our country over to them? So for a lot of Republicans, they recognize that they need this too. They need to be forced to come back and play the game again. And interestingly enough, somebody said today, well, if you pass this, Republicans will have to compromise. Jody Ernst said that from Iowa. And it's like, yeah, that's the point. You're going to have to stop being extremists out there and actually work for what Americans want. And when we've gotten to a point where 70%, 80%, 90% of Americans are going to want something and they can't get it because of the way the system has been gamed, that just can't stand. And we're in this moment, I think, in America where we're going to have to do a lot of changes to our system, not to make it go away from democracy, but to make it go back to democracy. And that's one of the things that they're talking about when we talk about the filibuster, is not doing something new, but simply reverting to the way it used to be, which was if you wanted to stop, as I keep saying, a filibuster is simply the ability. The Senate never came up with a way to make somebody stop talking. So all a filibuster is somebody refuses to stop talking. Well, we don't have that anymore. You can simply threaten a filibuster, and that's it. You kill anything. And that's precisely what former Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, a Republican from Kentucky, did. So when he talks very, this fiery language about breaking the Senate and he's, sort of saying all these horrible things about how can the Democrats do this, he did it. I mean, that horse is out of the barn, and he has created a completely dysfunctional system that we simply have to address or give up on democracy. And I don't think people are willing to give up on democracy. Now, do I think they'll get rid of the filibuster altogether? Over time, maybe. But I think right now the two options are either to exclude laws having to do with voting from the filibuster, the same way we have excluded judicial appointments and fiscal bills from the filibuster, um, or force whomever is talking to talk, not which is the way it used to be, rather than simply saying you can just literally phone in, I'm going to object to that bill, and all of a sudden it dies dead. There's a reason that Mitch McConnell talked about the Senate being the graveyard of bills. And again, that works fine if you're a party that doesn't want the government to do anything. But the American people want the government to do things. And it can't do it if a group of people can kill anything simply by literally texting, I don't like this bill. So anyway, somebody pointed out that Kinzinger is a Tea Party Republican. And like I say, I am not endorsing anybody here. But my point is that there is a difference between somebody who is willing to have an honest discussion and somebody who is not. And so far, anyway, and again, I am not a person who would vote for Kinzinger, but I'm perfectly happy to have him in part of the conversation in a way that I'm not willing to have somebody who's flat out lying to me, like Madison Cawthorn or whomever. Those people, to me, they don't belong in any political party. And that goes for the same on the Democrats or the Greens as well, or anybody else. All right, so another couple of questions here. Somebody asked, Kai Rysdahl from the Marketplace radio show asked recently, did the founders mean for democracy to be this difficult? And I hate to tell you, yes, they did. They meant for democracy to be difficult because democracy is really the lifeblood of the nation, and they wanted people to think and to be engaged and to advocate and to constantly be growing and changing. And there's a wonderful moment when Eisenhower says, when somebody writes to Eisenhower and says, would you stop talking about how complicated everything is and just tell us what to do? And Eisenhower writes back to him a very famous letter in which he said, no, that's what dictators do. Democracy is supposed to be hard. You're supposed to have to engage with it. You're supposed to have to recognize that it's not easy. I'd love for there to be an easy solution to the border right now. And there isn't one, because being a human being means having problems. And that's what it means to be a part of a democracy, is to engage constantly and to care about stuff and to be working to make it better all the time. So finally, I think that's most of the major questions. Oh, somebody asked about Sidney Powell's Dominion defamation suit, which I started writing about last night, and then I got sidetracked by the other stuff. She has, as you know, the Dominion voting systems, that's not the name of it, is it? Can't remember off the top of my head, has sued her for a huge sum of money. I'm not going to say how much it is, more than $1 billion, I believe, for her repeated baseless accusations that it rigged the election with the help of Venezuela. And she has responded yesterday. She responded by saying that no reasonable person would conclude that her accusations were, quote, truly statements of fact. That's the same argument that Tucker Carlson has used successfully to when he has been accused of defamation, for example. When he says stuff on his show, he has said, nobody could reasonably think that I'm saying anything that's real, that this is just opinion and I'm a performance artist. And she's trying that now. It's interesting. I wish more people knew about that. Obviously, she argued it in front of a court of law. She was thrown out. But I don't think this one's going to fly because she did take it to a court. So that's an interesting thing. And finally, I'm going to joke around here. Two of you asked me the meaning of life, and that I'm going to leave with that. And I'm going to leave with that because, as I said, I always want to emphasize that this is not, our American democracy is not waiting to see what's going to be done to you. It's having your oar in the water to see what where you pull the ship to shore. So I don't have any idea what the meaning of life is. I am not a minister and I'm not a spiritual guide, but I will tell you what gets me up in the morning. And the answer to that has always been to try and make the world a little bit better than it was when you came to it. And that works for me. whether it means, you know, helping somebody put their groceries in their car, or teaching Sunday school, or, you know, not blowing up at the kid who's asking for the 50,000th time how to do something. That works for me. And I guess for us, it's about trying to make American democracy a little bit better, at least from here. Anyway, so thank you for being here, and I will be back. I don't even know what day of the week it is, but I will be back soon, I guess. And now I'm going to go write about the NRA. Thank you for being here.